chip shortage. That's one of the hottest topics of discussion on Wall Street right now, with far-reaching implications and no easy fix. Here now with insights about the issue at hand and how it's expected to play out is Robert Maire. He's president of consulting firm Semiconductor Advisors. Thanks so much for being here today, Robert.
Glad to be here.
So explain to us from your perspective, what exactly is happening in the semiconductor sector right now that's put the group squarely in focus in the investor community?
Well, I think what we've seen is more demand side or supply chain issue than it is a manufacturing issue right now. It's somewhat akin to the toilet paper shortage that we saw in COVID, not to make light of it at all, but auto manufacturers and other manufacturers stopped ordering semiconductor chips for a number of months and then turned back on several months later and tried to get back in line, so to speak, to get into the factories to have chips manufactured. And it's not quite that simple. Semiconductor factories run typically at 90 to 95% utilization. So when you lose 3 months of utilization, it may take a very long time to sort of get back in line because basically all the production slots are accounted for. It's not like making fenders or motors or wheels where you can run the factory a little bit later into the night. These factories run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And in addition, a lot of the factories that make chips for, as an example, the automotive industry happen to be older factories because you don't make 25-cent chips used to control anti-lock brakes in a $10 billion factory. You build those in an old depreciated factory. So a lot of those factories, you can't even expand capacity because the equipment simply isn't made anymore or there isn't adequate capacity. So what we really saw was a dislocation on the demand side and lack of management of the supply chain. It's not like the semiconductor industry lost capacity or had factories burned down, much like the toilet paper industry. Didn't see that happen there either, but there was an excessive amount of demand coming out of COVID, and there was really a mismatch between demand and ability to fulfill that demand in a reasonable period of time.
And you mentioned the automotive group. We're hearing a lot from them about how this demand issue is causing huge production constraints on their end. Do you think that that's the biggest end market that has the implications here, or where do you think that the issue lies?
Well, I think that's the end market which has the highest leverage, whereas the average cost of a semiconductor that goes into an automobile application is typically about 40 or 50 cents. But that one part can stop a whole $50,000 car from being shipped. Obviously, if it's a chip that's going into the anti-lock brake system or the transmission or the engine. And today's cars have literally hundreds of chips in them. The chip value in a car exceeds the steel value in a car. Not many people understand that. And as we move into electric vehicles that have a lot more complex electronics in them, the semiconductor content goes even higher. So that's perhaps the example that has the highest leverage. But even small, cheap products such as electronic vape cigarettes have a chip inside them, and there are manufacturers of those small, few dollar items that have been unable to manufacture e-cigarettes, as an example, for lack of semiconductor chips.
So far-reaching impacts here. Now, when it comes to the semiconductor itself, who do you think are the biggest winners and losers in this situation? From a stock performance perspective, it's the chip equipment makers that have been the real outperformers as of late.
Yeah, well, certainly the biggest benefactor in all this is TSMC. They're the largest foundry in the world. They're located in Taiwan. TSM controls over 50% of the foundry market. That is the market that makes chips for other people. So they make chips for NVIDIA, for Qualcomm, even Intel. They make all the chips for Apple products. So they are really the backbone of the industry, and they are perhaps the biggest beneficiary. There are other companies who are in the foundry business. They go from small companies that make older chip technology, such as a small Israeli-based company called Tower Semiconductor. There's a company in Shanghai, SMIC, UMC, another Taiwanese company, Global Foundries in upstate New York. So there's a whole variety of companies that provide semiconductor chips across the spectrum, from bleeding edge to trailing edge technology.
And we're also hearing a lot about domestic chip manufacturing and how there are national security reasons for bringing chip production home. What's your sense of where we are with seeing that become a reality in a meaningful way?
Well, I've been talking about this for many years. Chip production has shifted from the US to overseas, and specifically to Taiwan, which is, only an hour or so's boat ride from mainland China, who has promised to reunite it at any and all costs necessary. So clearly that's a risk. If Taiwan were to stop producing semiconductors today, we'd see a problem much, much worse than the minor shortage that we're seeing right now. And even with a minor shortage, we're seeing significant impact in the auto industry and many other industries. If we had something happen to Taiwan, that would bring many, many industries to a grinding halt. So there's a huge amount of risk. In addition, from a defense and military and intelligence gathering, as you can imagine, the world has gotten more electronic with satellites and GPS and facial recognition and other intelligence and data gathering by governmental actors. And those things are more and more controlled by semiconductors and processors and artificial intelligence, machine learning, which all require advanced semiconductor devices. And China has been growing and spending quite a bit of money. They have allocated somewhere between 100 and 150 billion dollars to become self-reliant in semiconductors. And that would have a direct impact on defense and national security if that were to occur.
So you can't build these facilities overnight, though, in the US. So there's no easy fix here. How do you see the issues in this sector playing out over the next 12 to 18 months or so?
Well, I think in terms of the near-term shortage that we're experiencing, that will likely work itself out perhaps in 9 months to a year's time. Basically, we had a dearth of ordering for maybe 3 or 4 months, and given the excess capacity that's in the system, it'll probably take 9 to 12 months to get that back in line. But as you point out accurately, it takes quite a long time to build a semiconductor factory. The two $10 billion factories that Intel is proposing to build in Arizona will likely take a year to design, a year to build the buildings, and then a year or two to order the equipment, install the equipment. So those factories that they're talking about likely will not produce chips for 4 or 5 years. So the long-term fix will take a very long time. We've lost our edge in semiconductors over perhaps a 20-year or more period. So fixing it is not going to take a year. It's going to take, really more like 5 to 10 years likely.
And do you see this demand issue now turning into a potential oversupply issue at some point?
Well, I've warned investors about that on multiple occasions. This industry has historically been very cyclical, and the cyclicality of the industry is based on a relatively fragile balance between supply and demand. So typically, if you think of a standard bell-shaped cycle, in the bottom of the curve, demand for chips is low, therefore pricing is low, therefore capital spending to build new factories is low. So as demand for chips picks up, capital pricing picks up after that, and everybody says, hey, we're making a lot of money, let's build a new factory. Everybody's shovels go in the ground at the same time. 2 or 3 years down the road, additional capacity comes online, you get into an oversupply condition, and then it takes another 2 to 3 years for the excess capacity to be sort of worn off. It's much like the real estate market, let's say in Manhattan, where there's a shortage, everybody will start building new buildings. New buildings will come online in a couple of years' time. There'll be an oversupply, prices will collapse, and we'll see the cycle repeat. So it's very much a similar repetitive organic cycle that we see in the semiconductor industry. And this current dislocation could set us up for a significant down cycle potentially.
So there's a lot for investors to digest there. How do you think they should approach investments in this sector with everything that you've laid out?
Well, I think certainly the semiconductor equipment companies, as you point out, they're sort of the arms merchants to the industry, so they really don't care who wins the wars and who gets the market share. I think they've certainly benefited, as you pointed out, and I've been covering those companies for quite a while. And there's likely also an organic demand, a secular demand for semiconductor devices, which will help soften whatever down cycle we do see. So I think that the down cycle that we have ahead of us will not likely be as bad as prior down cycles, simply because demand has become so widespread, from IoT to servers to cryptocurrency to all these things that require semiconductor devices more so than it was 10 years ago, that will help soften any sort of downturn. So certainly companies like TSM that make the semiconductors, they're in a great position. Companies like Applied Materials, Lam Research, KLA, and most specifically ASML, who has sort of a monopoly on advanced technology.
All right, Robert. Well, thanks so much for weighing in. There's a lot to unpack there, and we really appreciate your insights today.
Okay, happy to be here again. Thanks.
Hi there. Thanks so much for watching Investing Strategies on our YouTube channel. If you want more executive interviews and analysis of key trends to watch, make sure you hit the subscribe button so you can stay up to date.